Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch Break Live with Tea Party Patriots Action. I'm Bill Pasco, Tea Party Patriots man in Washington, and I'm flying solo this week, so I'll be delivering the Washington Report and giving you the call to action. Even though it's a short week, it's going to be a busy week, so let's get right to it. Here's the Washington Report for Monday, October 9, 2023. The House may return Wednesday and stay in session through Thursday. The Senate is in recess this week. Let's reverse order. The Senate last week returned on Tuesday and voted to invoke cloture on the nomination of James C. O'Brien to be Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. On Wednesday, the Senate voted to confirm him to that position. Then the Senate voted to invoke cloture on and then to confirm Brendan Abel Herson to be U.S. District Judge for the District of Maryland and Kim DeClercq to be U.S. District Judge for the Eastern District of Michigan. And then they were done. This week in the Senate's in recess this week. When the Senate returns on Monday, October 16, the first vote will be set for 5:30 p.m. At that time, the Senate will proceed to a roll call vote on invoking cloture on the nomination of Jennifer Hall to be U.S. District Judge for the District of Delaware. Now, to last week in the House. The House returned on Monday and passed two bills under suspension of the rules. On Tuesday, the House took up the rule governing floor consideration of H.R. 4394, that's the Energy and Water Development Appropriations Act for FY24, and H.R. 4364, the Legislative Branch Appropriations Act for FY24. The rule passed by a vote of 218 to 208. Next up was a motion to table a privileged resolution offered by Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. The Gaetz resolution was a motion to vacate the speakership, a motion that had not been used in more than a century, to declare the speakership vacant. So, first, the House would attempt to sideline the Gaetz resolution with a motion to table. But 11 Republicans voted not to table the Gaetz resolution, and when their 11 votes were combined with the votes of 207 Democrats, that majority of 218 defeated the opposition of 208 Republicans, and the motion to table failed. The 11 Republicans who crossed party lines to vote with Democrats were Andy Biggs, Ken Buck, Tim Burchett, Eli Crane, Warren Davidson, Matt Gaetz, Bob Good, Nancy Mace, Corey Mills, Matt Rosendale, and Victoria Spartz. So then came the vote on the motion to vacate the chair. A yes vote would mean the member was voting to strip Kevin McCarthy of the speakership. A no vote would mean the member was voting to keep McCarthy in place. And then all hell broke loose. 8 Republicans crossed party lines to vote with Democrats in favor of deposing McCarthy. Those Republicans were Andy Biggs, Ken Buck, Tim Burchett, Eli Crane, Matt Gaetz, Bob Good, Nancy Mace, and Matt Rosendale. Consequently, by a vote of 216 to 210, Kevin McCarthy became the first speaker ever to lose his job as a result of a successful motion to vacate the chair. Following the vote, the clerk of the House revealed that Republican Congressman Patrick McHenry of North Carolina, chairman of the Financial Services Committee and a longtime member of the House Republican leadership structure, had been chosen by McCarthy to serve as acting speaker in the event of a vacancy in the speakership. This position is not described in the Constitution. It was created in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, when the congressional leadership, for the first time ever, had to contemplate the possibility of a sudden vacancy in the speakership and the need for continuity of government. So McHenry took the gavel and almost broke it as he slammed it down as hard as he could to end the session. And then they were done. This week in the House is currently scheduled to return to session on Wednesday. The first order of business will be the election of a new speaker, about which we will speak more in a moment. Now to Israel at war. On Saturday, we woke to the news that Israel, in the words of its longest-serving prime minister, was at war. Overnight, the militant Muslim terrorists of Hamas had attacked from strongholds in Gaza along its 37-mile border with Israel, and by air and by sea. Almost 24 individual cities and towns, some as far as 15 miles inside Israeli territory, were struck in a sophisticated attack that included the firing of at least 3,500 rockets. Hundreds of Israeli civilians were left dead, and others were taken hostage by Hamas militants and taken back to Gaza to provide physical security against retaliatory strikes and to serve as bargaining chips. It was the worst assault on Israeli territory, and clearly the worst Israeli intelligence failure, since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which was launched exactly 50 years and 1 day earlier. As of Sunday evening, more than 700 Israelis were counted dead, with more missing. We need to put that number in context. Israel today has a population of less than 10 million people. Losing 700 dead out of that size population is far worse, believe it or not, than the proportional loss we suffered on 9/11. On September 11, 2001, we lost 2,977 victims from a population that was then about 285 million. In order to lose as many people on 9/11 as Israel has over the last 2 days, we would have had to lose more than 20,000 people. Let that sink in for a moment. The Biden administration's first official response came not from the White House or the State Department, but from the Office of Palestine Affairs at the State Department. In a post to X, the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, the office wrote, quote, "We urge all sides to refrain from violence and retaliatory attacks. Terror and violence solve nothing," end quote. Ask the grateful citizens of France after the Normandy invasion if they believe violence solves nothing. Or ask the citizens of Kuwait circa mid-1991 after U.S. forces inflicted violence on Iraqi troops occupying Kuwait. History is full of examples of the proper use of violence, sometimes even in overwhelming force, for good moral ends. Worse, the simple phrase, "we urge all sides," is offensive. It equates the civilians of Israel with the murderous terrorists who savagely murdered them. It puts the two sides on the same moral plane. It's disgusting. To its credit, someone somewhere in the Biden administration recognized the idiocy of that statement. Or maybe they just feared the inevitable criticism. For whatever reason, the post was removed shortly after it was posted. Republican presidential contenders and leaders on Capitol Hill wasted little time making the connection. It wasn't even a month ago that the Biden administration, as part of a deal with Iran, had unfrozen $6 billion in Iranian funds that had been sanctioned and had been sitting in a South Korean bank. Iran, the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, has long been known as a principal funder of Hamas. So, Biden funds Iran, and Iran funds Hamas, and Hamas attacks Israel. The Biden administration responds, of course, that the $6 billion cannot be used for such purposes. It is only to be used for humanitarian purposes, it insists, and all the money is still sitting in a bank account in Qatar. So, don't blame us, they say, for the Hamas attack against Israel. But everyone knows money is fungible. Of course that $6 billion will never be used for terrorist purposes. The Iranian government will use a different pot of money for terrorist purposes. Here's the thing. The Iranian regime now has $6 billion under its control that it didn't have in its budget at the start of the year. And that means it can take $6 billion it was planning to spend on humanitarian stuff and redirect it to support terrorism against the U.S. and its allies, like Israel. So don't be confused. A decision by the Biden administration has helped make this Hamas attack on Israel possible. On Sunday afternoon, in an exclusive, the Wall Street Journal reported that Iran had been involved up to its eyeballs in planning the attack with Hamas and Hezbollah. Officers of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps had worked over several weeks with the terrorists and had signed off and given the green light for the assault at a meeting in Beirut, in Lebanon, just last Monday. The source of the story? Senior members of Hamas and Hezbollah. A few thoughts here. First, Iran's interest is obvious. Iran has been worried about Israel's diplomatic outreach to Iran's principal rival in the world of Islam, Saudi Arabia. Encouraging its client, Hamas, to attack Israel is a threefer for Iran. Not only does it cause death and destruction to the nation Iran's leaders have vowed to wipe off the face of the map, it provokes a retaliatory response from Israel that's likely to result in calling a screeching halt to the ongoing Israeli-Saudi talks. And it also helps Iran's ally, Russia, prosecute its war against Ukraine, because U.S. military assistance to Israel will likely take precedence over U.S. military assistance to Ukraine. So Hamas's attack on Israel will reduce the defensive capabilities of Ukraine for at least a time. Second, former CIA Director and Defense Secretary Bob Gates, who spent 4 decades in service to his country, most of them in the highest levels of our national security infrastructure, said in his 2014 memoir about then Vice President Joe Biden, quote, "I think he has been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades," unquote. Gates's warning has been proven right again. If you don't think Biden's disastrous execution of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, his fecklessness in responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and his continued outreach, including the effective gift of $6 billion to Iran in pursuit of a pipe dream, didn't have anything to do with creating the conditions for this terrorist attack on our strongest ally in the Middle East, well, you haven't been paying attention. Now to aid to Ukraine. Aid to Ukraine has now become an issue in the contest for Speaker. Steve Scalise has had a strong record of support for U.S. aid, but Jim Jordan has loudly said he wouldn't immediately bring Ukraine funding to the floor. Not one more penny, he said last week. President Biden has said he plans to make a major address on why the U.S. should continue supporting Ukraine, but he hasn't said when he will give that talk. Meanwhile, in search of additional support for her opposition to continued U.S. assistance to Ukraine, Georgia Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene has embraced the radical anti-American activists known as Code Pink. On Wednesday afternoon of last week, she posed for a picture outside the Capitol with radicals from the group that has opposed U.S. policy all over the world and the U.S. government itself for the last 2 decades. She should be embarrassed by any association with this group. Elsewhere, on the same Wednesday, the Green was meeting with radical leftists, a group of more than 100 conservative foreign policy experts, including a fair number of former Trump administration officials, released a letter urging Congress to approve more military assistance to Ukraine. Formed as the Vandenberg Coalition, a nod to former U.S. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who, as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the years immediately following the conclusion of World War II, worked across party lines with Democrat President Harry Truman to create and implement a strong anti-communist foreign policy, and who famously said, "Politics stops at the water's edge." The group wrote, quote, "As conservatives, we are committed to the principle advanced by all Republican presidents since Eisenhower, that the best way to keep America safe is to keep America strong. Americans are rightly frustrated by the Biden administration's Ukraine policy. His half measures have cost lives and time. It is a mystery to us why some would look at the president's record on this issue and criticize him for being too strong. Only through decisive American leadership on the Ukraine war will Americans be safe at home and abroad." Now to illegal immigration. If you felt a tremor in the force last Wednesday, that was likely caused by Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas' announcement that the Biden administration would reverse itself and build about 20 miles of border wall along the Texas border. Quote, "There is presently an acute and immediate need to construct physical barriers and roads in the vicinity of the border of the United States in order to prevent unlawful entry into the United States in the project areas," he said in an official filing in the Federal Register. Quote, "In order to ensure the expeditious construction of the barriers and roads in the project areas, I have determined that it is necessary that I exercise the authority that is vested in me by Section 102C of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act. Mayorkas waived 26 federal laws, including the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, to direct that the construction begin as soon as possible. President Biden, as a candidate for office in 2020, had famously said that there would, quote, not be another foot of wall constructed if he were to be elected president. Asked to explain the apparent reversal, administration spokespeople said the Congress had appropriated the money years ago, and Biden had been unpersuasive in convincing the Congress to redirect it. Asked directly if he thought border walls were effective, Biden simply said no. Now to the latest on the Biden crime family saga. On Tuesday morning of last week, in a federal courthouse in Wilmington, Delaware, Hunter Biden pleaded not guilty to 3 felony charges related to his purchase and possession of a firearm in 2018. 2 of the counts were for making false statements when he completed a form to purchase a gun and asserted on the form that he was not addicted to or using illegal drugs. The 3rd count is for unlawful possession of the firearm. Biden's lawyer, Abby Lowell, asserted that, quote, there is an agreement in effect, referring to the diversion agreement Lowell had reached on Hunter's behalf with federal prosecutors in July, before a related plea deal blew up. The prosecutors claim that agreement was never valid because it did not have the signature of a probation officer. Meanwhile, CNN reported that Hunter's legal bills have risen to $10 million based on the legal work done for him over the last several years as he defends himself. Wrote CNN, Hunter Biden's allies had hoped that fundraising help would have come by now from top supporters of his father, President Joe Biden, but that hasn't happened, end quote. It doesn't take an ethics genius to see the obvious danger here. The notion that the president's ne'er-do-well son is deeply in debt and in need of a bailout offers such a juicy opportunity for some daddy warbucks to earn the president's undying gratitude by simply writing a big check to a perfectly legal defense fund. Elsewhere, on Wednesday evening, Just the News reported that, quote, a mere 16 days after Joe Biden assumed the presidency, top officials in his Justice Department raised suspicion among career IRS agents by demanding a briefing on the criminal investigation into Hunter Biden, according to evidence turned over to Congress that raises new questions about Attorney General Merrick Garland's claims of an interference-free probe, end quote. Some of those officials were political appointees whose jurisdictions had nothing to do with the areas being investigated by IRS and DOJ, and their interest in the case aroused suspicions. Congressional investigators are following up. Now to the latest on the spending fight. The proximate cause of the decision by Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz to depose Speaker McCarthy was, allegedly, the Speaker's failure to keep promises he made in January when he was trying to be elected Speaker over a return to what's called regular order in the appropriations process. A law passed in 1974, the Impoundment and Budget Control Act, creates a budget and appropriations process to be used by the Congress. That law says Congress is supposed to deal with appropriations one bill at a time for a total of 12 bills that fund the discretionary portion of the annual federal budget. But for the better part of the last quarter century, Congress has not followed that law. Instead of dealing with appropriations bills one at a time, congressional leaders have instead waited until there's a deadline hanging over their heads, either the end of the fiscal year or the upcoming Thanksgiving vacation or the upcoming Christmas recess, whatever. And then they've used the leverage provided by the scent of jet fumes in the air to get their fellow members to sign off on one giant bill composed of the 12 bills all wrapped together with all kinds of junk thrown in. That's how we get 3,000-page omnibus bills that no one reads because no one can read them in the little amount of time they're given to read them. And that's how we get bridges to nowhere and $3 million studies of spider mating patterns and the like. The best way to defeat that is to return to regular order, where the Congress deals with each of the 12 individual appropriations bills one at a time. Spending hawks know this, and they bargained for it with McCarthy. He wanted their votes, and they wanted to return to regular order. So they traded their votes in January for a promise by him that when it came time to pass appropriations bills, Congress would break the recent pattern of rolling everything into one giant omnibus bill at the end of the year and would instead deal with each one at a time. Then, you'll recall, McCarthy entered into negotiations with President Biden over raising the debt ceiling. As part of that negotiation, McCarthy and Biden agreed on top-line numbers for discretionary spending for the year. They agreed to spend $1.586 trillion on discretionary spending, including $886 billion on defense and the rest on non-defense discretionary spending. The conservatives were very upset. They had wanted a return to dealing with each appropriations bill one at a time so they could force the spending levels down, not up. They wanted a return to pre-COVID spending levels, and they were upset that McCarthy had clinched a deal with Biden that would seemingly mandate raising those spending levels. McCarthy, for his part, said he never meant for anyone to believe that the levels he set in the deal with Biden were set in stone. Those were ceilings, he said, not floors. There was nothing in the agreement he reached with Biden, he said, that required that we actually spend all that money. If the House wanted to spend less and could pass appropriations bills pegged to spend less, well, that was all well and good. Democrats were outraged. The White House said that was not Biden's understanding of the deal. But McCarthy went with his spin for the months of June, July, and August, insisting that the House could choose to appropriate lower amounts and then send those bills to the Senate, where they would be increased before conference committees began their work to reconcile the differences. But McCarthy failed to pass the 12 appropriations bills in a timely fashion. As the last few days of September arrived, the House had passed only 4 of the 12 bills. The Senate had passed none. In order to keep the government open, a short-term continuing resolution would be required. McCarthy knew the conservatives would not like this, so he tried to sweeten the castor oil of the CR with the sugars of significant spending reductions, a tough border security bill, the creation of a debt commission, and no additional money for Ukraine, despite the White House's urgent request for $24 billion in additional assistance, all wrapped into the CR. It was truly a conservative CR. But some Republicans focused much more on the fact that it was a CR than on the fact that it was conservative. And 21 Republicans voted no, and the CR failed. Then the next day, the last day of September, the last day of the fiscal year, the deadline for action to avoid a temporary partial government shutdown, to everyone's surprise, McCarthy introduced a totally different kind of CR, a 45-day CR that funded everything at current levels. Read, levels set by the Nancy Pelosi-controlled lame duck House back in December of 2022. And every Democrat who voted for it, except for one, because he's the co-chairman of the Congressional Ukraine Caucus. 126 Republicans, a clear majority, also voted for it. But the fact that McCarthy had moved a less conservative CR to the floor and then had relied on Democrat votes to pass it outraged Gates, we were told. And that, we were told, was because of his concerns over the need to get spending under control. In that context, it's very troubling to read an interview in Politico with Republican Congressman Tom Cole. Cole is the chairman of the Rules Committee and the second-ranking Republican on the Appropriations Committee, so he's got more influence over the course of appropriations bills in the House than any other single individual. And what Cole said in this interview is that since the conservatives had to deal with McCarthy to lower spending levels in the appropriations bill, and the conservatives have now removed McCarthy from his position as Speaker, the deal is no longer valid. It's void. After all, one of the two parties to the deal is no longer in place. So Gates's stated explanation for his action to remove McCarthy because McCarthy failed to live up to his promise to get spending under control has now resulted in exactly what Gates says he opposes, a lack of control on spending. Meanwhile, the Senate still has yet to pass a single appropriations bill. The clock is ticking. The current continuing resolution keeps the government open until November 17, 5 weeks from now. Now to the contest for Speaker. For the first time in the history of the nation, the Speaker of the House has been removed midterm by his own colleagues via the motion to vacate. Without a speaker, the House cannot act, bills cannot be brought to the floor, and debates cannot take place. Consequently, the first item of business for the House upon its return this week will be the election of a new Speaker. Many House Republicans will return Monday. The first official meeting of the full body, the House Republican Conference, will take place Tuesday at 5 p.m. At that time, they will begin the process of what many hope will be a no-holds-barred discussion amongst themselves regarding the two announced candidates to replace McCarthy as Speaker. That's current Majority Leader Steve Scalise, the number 2 man in the current leadership structure, and current Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan, who also serves as the chairman of the subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government. Oklahoma Republican Congressman Kevin Hern, who now serves as the chairman of the largest caucus of Republicans in the House, the Republican Study Committee, considered tossing his hat into the ring, but announced on Saturday he would not. Former President Trump endorsed Chairman Jordan late last week. Tea Party Patriots Action also endorsed Jordan and signed on to a letter with a number of other conservative organizations endorsing Jordan for the job. From all sides of the conference comes word that all members believe the conference should not leave the room to go vote on the floor of the House until it has settled on a candidate who can get 217 votes on the floor. That's a majority in a House with 2 vacancies, 433 total. There will not be a 15-vote marathon this time, as there was in January when McCarthy struggled to win election. If all goes as planned, House Republicans will make their choice amongst themselves on Wednesday morning. They could move as early as Wednesday to go to the floor to formally elect a new Speaker. Of course, it's quite possible that neither Scalise nor Jordan can garner the 217 votes necessary to be in a position to win the speakership. If that happens, the contest will continue. Others may enter the race at that point. There was a trial balloon floated over the weekend to see if anyone was interested in drafting Kevin McCarthy to take up the job he had just been removed from, but that didn't seem to go anywhere. Some others think possibly the acting Speaker, Patrick McHenry from North Carolina, might be tapped. But I have a hard time seeing that. McHenry is the acting Speaker because Kevin McCarthy chose him to be the acting Speaker in the event of a catastrophe. He is quite literally McCarthy's hand-picked successor. I cannot imagine the 8 Republicans who voted to remove McCarthy agreeing to let McCarthy's pick take the job as his permanent successor. Now to the Jenny Beth Show. 2 more episodes of the Jenny Beth Show dropped last week. On Wednesday, episode 33, featuring Jenny Beth's discussion with Louisiana State Representative Blake Miguez, dropped. It's entitled Turning Louisiana Red and Giving the People the Government They Deserve, and that's what it's about. On Friday, episode 34 dropped. That podcast features Jenny Beth's discussion with another member of the Louisiana State Legislature, State Representative Danny McCormick. As the episode title makes clear, he's a man with a backbone, fighting for freedom in the Louisiana swamp. Both are highly recommended. Tune in on Apple, Amazon, and all your other podcast channels. And that's our Washington Report for this week. Now, the call to action. It's very simple this week. We'd like you to call your congressman or congresswoman tomorrow and urge him or her to vote for Jim Jordan for Speaker. Over the weekend, Tea Party Patriots Action endorsed Jordan officially as he seeks the speakership. We signed on to a letter with a number of other conservative organizations and leaders, including former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, former Ohio Secretary of State J. Kenneth Blackwell, former Reagan administration officials Morton Blackwell and Ken Cribb, Citizens United President David Bossie, Conservative Partnership Institute Chairman Jim DeMint, and Media Research Center founder and president Brent Bozell, among others. The voting in the House Republican Conference will begin Wednesday morning, and they could go to the floor of the House as early as Wednesday afternoon. So please don't waste any time. Call tomorrow. Do not call today, because it's a federal holiday in Washington, and they're not answering the phones in their offices. Wait until tomorrow and call then with a simple message. Please vote for Jim Jordan for Speaker. That's our call to action for this week. As always, if you've got any questions about anything, you can send us an email at jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. That's jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. If it's a question you want me to answer on the air, just add "for broadcast" to the subject line for broadcast, and I'll answer it on the air. Thanks for tuning in. Until next week, be well and be active.